Dear guests, we are almost finishing our conference first day, and we're moving to the third panel, which is the last one. So the bravest and the most courageous are here, and we're starting the panel, which is titled China, Great Powers and Colliding Interests Between the East and West in Eurasia. And we are having a case study of Hong Kong. So the first, our speaker will be Dr. Greg Simons from Uppsala University, Sweden, Turiba University, Latvia. And Dr. Greg Simons will speak about great power competition in Eurasia, actions and reactions in a transforming global geopolitical order. So the first speech is via Zoom. Please, Doctor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So my presentation is including Hong Kong, but it's a much wider kind of understanding. So taking the global geopolitical context into account. So if we look at what is happening currently globally, there is a geopolitical transformation underway, and this transformation is it's not solidified yet. It's a process rather than a final result yet, but it's moving away from this Western-centric US unipolar world order towards a more non-Western-centric multipolar world order. And with such transformations, it has a tendency to increase conflict and competition. Owing no less to the situation that a hegemon is usually not willing to give up their position as a hegemon without attempting to at least defend it, this position, as it comes with benefits and privileges which other actors don't. So if we look at this current situation, it's created a lot of conflict in the world, and especially around Eurasia. And this increased competition is manifesting in different ways, but we can come back to what Brzezinski said in 1997 in his grand chessboard. And here he talked about the geostrategic imperatives of an empire, as he referred to it, to maintain their hegemonic position. And this revolved around three geostrategic imperatives. The first one was to keep vassal states dependent and, well, if we like, obedient to the imperial center. The second was to keep those client states protected and dependent. And the third point was to ensure that those states or powers that were opposing the so-called barbarians, to prevent them from coming together in order to be able to successfully challenge the position of the hegemon. And this was his understanding of the role of different historical hegemons, as, for example, the British Empire or the Roman empires before, and which he also assigned to the US, that they should learn from these historical examples in order to maintain, or at that stage, if we're looking at 1997, to expand their power and influence. So if we come forward a bit, there have been a number of transformations which have resulted, and this has included a relative decline of power and influence in the US in terms of its ability to be dominating the global area uncontested. So, I mean, this era is over. I mean, you've had the likes of Nixon and Cooley and others who say that the US is a declining hegemon. And so therefore it is necessary to manage this decline. And others would argue, Nixon and Cooley's argued that this should be managed. Others have argued that it should be contested, that they should take back their position. And if we come to the era immediately after Trump, so that this is when Biden was coming back into power. So if we look even slightly before that, but Biden made the statement that the US intended to take back its role as the world's leading state, that is the global hegemon. And this is put in foreign affairs. So, I mean, this is a categorical statement of the intent of the US not to manage its decline, but to contest its decline. And if we look 1 year earlier than that, there was the RAND report, which was on imposing cost and overstretching measures for Russia in the area of post-Soviet space. So they name, and also Syria on top of that. So these key areas in Eurasia, for example, causing different problems for Russia to try and manage and overstretch the capacity to do so. So it was suggested, for example, in Belarus, in the South Caucasus, namely Nagorno-Karabakh, and also Kazakhstan and other places. Now, the problem for the US is that if we go back 10, 15 years at least, Russia and China have begun to cooperate in Eurasia. So this is one of the points which Brzezinski warned about, that is allowing the so-called, what he termed as barbarians coming together, those challenger states to the US hegemony. And so, I mean, this point, what we see now with a weakened US is that it is trying to contest areas on a regional basis. I mean, so what we see in Ukraine is one example of that, where geoeconomics and geopolitics are coming together in order to try and weaken and contain not only Russia, but also China, as we see with what was Trump's essentially economic warfare through sanctions with China, but also what we see in the South China Sea. And of course, we can also go further abroad, and we can see the contestation over the Solomon Islands, who decided to sign a security agreement with China. Now, if we come more to China, one can more clearly see the capacity of geoeconomics supporting geopolitics. That is the Belt Road Initiative as a means to expand its geopolitical influence. And of course, this is seen as being a direct threat by the US, and we see one of the responses to it already from 2012 with Obama's Asia pivot. So this is one of those points where we have this idea of different dimensions of strategy. So, I mean, we got 5 different areas of strategy, dimensions of strategy: land, water, air, space, and information. So what you see is, you see the physical spaces being contested, land and water and air. I mean, if we look at what's been happening with not only in Ukraine, but also more broadly speaking, these other conflicts which are or can erupt, for example, what we saw attempting to be created, a similar situation with Taiwan, which was following quite a similar trajectory if we look at this from an information space dimension. So, I mean, these are aimed at containing and limiting the ability of those leading powers of the multipolar order to expand. And this has been done by different strategies. On the one hand, it's the US trying to rebuild its old alliances in order to contain, such as revitalizing NATO, but also these ideas about creating, for example, an Arab NATO, and also NATO showing interest in expanding its activities and influence into the Pacific. So, and also trying to engage in wedging, that is to take away those smaller powers which are aligned with Russia and China. So, for example, if we look at what has been happening in the Southeast Asia, where there have been hard choices made by local politicians. So, for example, the Philippines, but not only the Philippines, also Singapore, who were openly talking about that countries.
Because we have only 1 minute to finish.
Okay, so the point is that this has created this rather binary kind of choices for smaller powers, which are smaller than either Russia, China, or the United States, to either be with a country or against a country. There is increasingly little middle way to have an independent path. There are also attempts to weaken countries, those countries, such as attempts to create chaos in Hong Kong. And why Hong Kong? This is where China was accessing global financial markets. So there are different strategies which are being used to try and limit those different powers through informational means. And I will finish it there. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Greg Simons. Applauses to you. Thank you very much. And we will collect questions for further discussion. And now it's my pleasure to invite Mr. Midas and Dijk, is it right? Dijk, okay. And Mr. Chris Wensink, right? So co-authors of Regionalization Eurasia, Leiden University Press, and they are going to talk about the regionalization of Eurasia. Why regions are the future. The floor is yours, gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
10 minutes.
10 minutes. We'll try to be quick. Hello, everybody. How are you feeling? Full of energy? Yes? All right. We are, of course, the brave speakers, but then you are also a brave audience. So we'll try to do you justice. And also we will try to persuade you to read our book, Regionalizing Eurasia. So this morning we heard a very nice keynote speakers panel. And as Mr. Morris said, they were by and large in agreement on a lot of topics. All right. Do you hear me? All right. So as Mr. Morris said, the keynote speakers were in agreement. We believe we may have a bit of a different perspective, so that could be exciting. And that is based on two ideas. First of all, we think there are structural causes for deglobalization, not just in politics, but also in other areas that we will expand upon. And the second idea is that instead of being something that we should fear, it is actually something that holds out a lot of opportunities that are positive as well. So regionalizing Eurasia, that is about a few different points. So the first point that we're going to be talking about is regionalization of production, relocation of production back to target markets. The second part is going to be about finance, a very globalized topic that is also going to become more regionalized. Then we are going to talk about the implications for international relations, international security. And then we are also going to be talking a bit about the internet and how that is also going to regionalize. As you will all agree with us, Eurasia is where world history happens. So that is what we are talking about today. So I give the floor over to Chris for our first topic.
Thank you very much, Midas. I'll just jump into it. At the core, I think, of our argument lies an economic process, which is that we maintain the different movements in the global economy leads to a relocation of production closer to, or in fact, back into target markets. So there's the convergence of labor costs nowadays. Producing your goods in the Chinese centers of production is often not really that much cheaper anymore than producing it back in Europe or close to Europe or other markets around the globe. That leads to either reshoring, meaning relocating production actually at the target market, or nearshoring, where you move it to countries closer to the market, such as, for instance, in the case of Europe, to Turkey, or to parts of Eastern Europe or North Africa. Other factors that basically come into the same equation are transportation costs, which sort of have to be, economically speaking, have to be added to your production costs. There's the costs of climate mitigation that also mean that markets such as Europe or the United States will start to tax the emission of greenhouse gases as part of the production cost process, and also in order to sort of ramp up their own economic position. Part of that could also mean introducing higher standards to which only technologically more advanced companies can adhere. There's also an element of opportunity to that, especially for markets where production is heading to. Opportunities for blue collar work, especially also the lower or other middle income classes, and as a part of world regions, the actual peripheries of those regions. Take, for instance, the state of Alabama in the United States, to which we also refer to in the book. Used to be sort of given up as a production site, and nowadays you see that it's actually up again. Same can be said about regions in Europe and other places. At the same time, there are now being seen limits to export-based development. So the Chinese model of developing through export is, in our view, clearly coming to an end, at least on the scale on which it was seen before. Nevertheless, it's not that we foresee an end to the globalized economy. It's more like a side turn, and not to in mind. Midas, about finance.
Yes, thank you, Chris. Let's see how it works. There we go. So what has been going on in the world of finance? Two processes interconnected. First one is the virtualization of money. Money used to be connected to intrinsic value, and it has become over the year far more and more virtual. One of the main events in there, of course, the 1972 Nixon shock, in which the Americans decided that the dollar does not longer connect to gold. So it's now only connected to the value that it is perceived to have. At the same time, also a huge globalization of the financial world. It is now possible to invest not only in your own continent, but also to the other side of the world, into economies that are very different from your home economy. And that increase of opportunity has led to a huge proliferation of debt. in the world economy, both public debt, but also private debt. And that is a problem that we need to solve somehow. And if you want to solve a problem of unsustainable debt, there are a few steps that you can take. First of all, monetary expansion. You can try to lower interest rates, try to increase the money supply by quantitative easing and other unorthodox ways. But that has, of course, a limit. And that limit seems to have been reached right now with inflation reaching up until 10% and more in Europe and in the United States, which means that this monetary expansion has really reached its limit before you reach a territory of hyperinflation. So then another solution that you can take if your debt is unsustainable is to agree on a haircut, which means that you agree to reduce the value of the outstanding debt. For instance, what happened with Greece within the Eurozone. And then another option, which is a bit less organized, is a default by which a financial institution or even a specific country decides that it is no longer going to pay back what it has loaned. For instance, the state of Argentina has defaulted multiple times on its debt. But the message here is that all of these solutions will drive further regionalization, because if you cannot rely on getting your money back, it becomes far less attractive to invest outside of your own political structure. Going into the implications for international relations.
Yes, thank you. I think also with an eye on the time, yes, I'll speed up. I think the main point here is, I think much of this has already been discussed today, but for our argument, increased global competition is a further driver for regionalization. And the reason is simple, that blocs, regional alliances have to become more self-reliant in order to withstand sort of the pressures of the increased international competition that we witness today. Let's just go through this rather quickly.
Sure. So yeah, sure. The next part is about the internet, which we feel is going to be split into at least two parts. As our panel leader has already demonstrated, there's at this moment only two powers that can really handle all of the different areas of the internet. And that means that the internet is going to be split into at least two parts. Furthermore, important to understand, when the internet started, it was something that the US, that allowed the US to spread its own message, and that other countries had to defend against, also with the infamous Great Firewall of China. Nowadays, also the United States and Europe are also the target of risks in the online sphere, and that means that they are also motivated to split the internet up.
So coming to our final slides, this is just an overview of the book. So we see there's the conceptual part, which we have just addressed in broad terms, and then we have 4 case studies on regional blocs and alliances. I think a very valuable contribution to what is going on today, to be modest. The book is on your favorite web store, or if you wish to know more about it, please come to us after this panel. And Mayor, thanks for having us and organizing this great conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We also recommend to have a look at this book and to try to share ideas and to get more knowledge about the Eurasian regionalization. And I like the cartoons. They were very cute. Thank you so much. So next speaker is Dr. Sanja Arežina, counselor with the government of the Republic of Serbia, senior research associate and associate professor at the University of Belgrade, Serbia. AsiaGlobal Fellow. We've talked about AsiaGlobal Fellow today already. So one of the participants is already here today with us as a panelist. Dr. Sanja is going to speak about the topic between geopolitics and economy Is it possible balancing between the East and the West in the time of uncertainty? Doctor, the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pazian. 什么下午好，我很荣幸有机会今天下午跟贵宾参加这个论坛。Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, good afternoon. I would like to greet all of you and to thank the organizers for the invitation. I'm very honored to have the opportunity to deliver my speech at this conference with the topic between geopolitics and economy. Is it possible balancing between the East and the West in the time of uncertainty? So at the very beginning, I have to state that we are all witnessing that the world has changed significantly in the last 3 decades since the end of the Cold War. And with the advent of the unipolar world and the globalization, many analysts naively thought that the era of geopolitics was over. The impression that the ideological disagreements between the great powers and the rising powers will not be an obstacle to trade cooperation continued even in the new multipolar world. So after the global financial crisis in 2008, many countries adopted the strategy of turning to the East due to the lack of fresh capital in the West. In the years that followed, China's rising, Russia's return, and Turkey's greater involvement turned many countries to strengthening economic and energy cooperation with them. So inevitably, along with the growing economic cooperation, bilateral political cooperation, and mutual support within international organizations began to strengthen more and more. So the result was that many countries began to apply a balancing strategy in their foreign policy, trying to maintain good relations with the West and the East at the same time. This strategy gave good results until a few years ago, when growing tensions have shown that geopolitics has experienced its renaissance, and that the future will be significantly marked by ideological divisions. The growing competition and rivalry between the great powers and the rising powers, especially between the US and China, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemics and its consequences, the efforts to achieve decoupling in technology between the US and China, a growing protectionism and populism, as well as the increasingly complicating Ukrainian crisis, are just some of the factors that significantly make it impossible for states to continue with the balancing strategy between the East and the West. So in such circumstances, an artificial atmosphere of who is not with me is against me is created, in which these countries are asked to make a choice and side with one of the existing blocks of states. Thus, countries like Singapore, Indonesia, and Serbia are under increasing pressure from the Western international community to deviate from the balancing strategy towards the direction of political and ideological alignment, especially after the beginning of the Ukrainian crisis. There are also countries like Moldova, which with the strengthening of the Ukrainian crisis are increasingly under the pressure to abandon their constitutionally proclaimed strategy of neutrality. And due to the changed international circumstances, some other countries independently began to review their decades-long neutral course in foreign policy, such as Norway and Sweden, which promised direct military support to Ukraine, while some of the countries like Switzerland joined the Western countries in adopting sanctions against Russia. And yet in such circumstances, with the return of an atmosphere that increasingly resembles Cold War politics, instead of succumbing to the pressure they suffer from the great powers. The exact opposite is happening. Developing and underdeveloped countries increasingly start to reach for the Cold War conceptual toolbox, aware that the great powers, due to their interests, often do not even think about their needs to develop and progress economically. So therefore, these countries are increasingly starting to use a balancing strategy that should enable them to maintain a strategic middle ground and have a greater flexibility in foreign policy decisions in order to create a more optimal environment for their economic development and maintain the status quo of enjoying economic dividends of healthy relations both with the West and the East. They are guided by the old Indo-Chinese proverb, when the elephant fights, the grass is the one who loses. So in practice, this can be seen on the example of the Ukrainian crisis. For example, in early March, many countries that voted in the United Nations General Assembly for resolutions that Russia should immediately, completely and unconditionally withdraw from Ukraine, or for humanitarian protections of Ukrainians, abstained or voted against the following month when there was voting to expel Russia from the UN Human Rights Council. The abstentions are particularly visible in the countries of the global south, such as Egypt, Ghana, India, and Indonesia, which were landing. These countries were leading countries of the non-aligned movement. So these countries advocate respect for the territorial sovereignty, but have a great animosity towards sanctions that consider is applied in a sort of selective, politicized way with a lot of double standards, basically a tool of the United States hegemony rather than a tool of global justice. At the end, I would like to conclude that bloc divisions that create a new Cold War mentality generally do not bring anything good to countries in the time of uncertainty, especially developing and underdeveloped countries. These countries have recognized that, they recognize this, which is why they strive to maintain equal channels of communication with all parties by practicing the balancing strategy in order to increase the space of cooperation and prevent the onset of probably new global financial crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for interesting speech, Dr. Sanja Arežina, and the floor now goes to Mr. Jason Yip and Mr. Brian Wong. Mr. Jason Yip is CEO at MWYO Hong Kong, China, and Mr. Brian Wong is Rhodes Scholar and Tutor in Politics, University of Oxford. They are going to introduce us the topic on understanding Hong Kong's political trajectory through lenses of great power politics. Thank you very much for being with us, and the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Brian and my colleagues are all coming from Hong Kong. So we would like to share with you the story of Hong Kong through the lenses of geopolitics of all the important countries around us. So it is, no doubt, Hong Kong is a very successful international financial center, and a lot of locations in the world trying to understand how can it be possible, whether they can mimic that model somewhere in the world. But Brian and I have been studying and discussing the success of Hong Kong is actually based on a lot of convergence of interest between all the big countries and in good dynamics with the local factors that are operating in Hong Kong. So through our presentation today, we would like to go through review the evolution and a series of political events in Hong Kong between 1997 and 2022, which is this year, and try to make the following claim. Firstly, the Hong Kong's fate is deeply intertwined with the Sino-American relations. And secondly, Hong Kong, as a very small economy or small territory, still have its agency role to improve or deteriorate the Sino-American relations. And lastly, building on the two-level game framework of Putman, we would like to everyone to consider realism need to take small and medium quasi non-sovereign powers behavior seriously in the roadmap of geopolitics. So to start with, which is we call the phase one, is from 1980s to the handover of Hong Kong, which is basically the colonial period at the very, very last stage in the territory of Hong Kong. In this period, internationally, we see a pretty cautiously alignment of interest between China and the West, mainly Britain and US in the discussions. For example, Britain knows that they have to return Hong Kong to China and they have to manage the risk and the liability. And at the same time, the mainland China at that moment have a very pragmatic approach because they want the reunifications to have Hong Kong rejoining China, which is important in the international agenda. What about domestic factor? Hong Kong was always in the context of depoliticized situations, so everyone can focus on economic development. So that's why you can have a boom of economic development at that particular period. I think that is also related to the approach of the colonial government at that moment to have very resounding top-down approach to solve local issue, and at the same time the laissez-faire approach to let the economy of Hong Kong to flourish by itself. So the outcome of all these international and domestic factors working together, which create Hong Kong as a financial entry port to reach China and the rest of the world, and also successfully to transform Hong Kong from an industrial center to become a service center that's supporting China and the rest of the world. So for the next phase, I will pass it to Brian.
Thank you very much, Jason. Thank you all for the opportunity. So the second phase in our diagnosis constitutes essentially the early days of the post-handover period of Hong Kong, all the way up until 2008, which, as many of you might recall, was essentially almost like the climax of China's relative soft power in relation to at least vast swathes of the West, as epitomized by, of course, the Beijing Olympics, as well as the resounding demonstration of national solidarity, in air quotes, in the aftermath of the disastrous events earlier that year in relation to the Sichuan earthquake. So we're just going to break this down, I think, into two different levels of analysis, because the international climate that surrounded Hong Kong's development essentially constituted a broad period of rapprochement that, despite tensions, including, of course, the 1999 bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, the near misses and the sort of almost a confrontation clash between the two countries, Chinese and American warplanes towards the end of the 1990s, with China's accession to the WTO under Jiang Zemin, as well as attempts under both Bill Clinton and George Bush to reorient and reestablish a more moderated and, I guess, balanced approach to China at large. There was a broad period of rapprochement in terms of China's international relations. Bob Zoellick termed this essentially an extended effort at converting China into a responsible stakeholder, which obviously reflected what the Western expectations of China's behaviors and also incentives in the international framework would be. That was not reciprocated by the Chinese counterparts, who instead saw both the recommendations of responsible stakeholdership and also the Washington prescriptions of a G2 approach, both far too demanding on one hand in terms of prescribing very specific conceptions of what territorial claims and also constituted acceptable behaviors of China vis-a-vis South China Seas and also Taiwan. And on the other hand, they also felt that America was shoehorning China into a position that was neither comfortable with nor genuinely benefited from, e.g. co-sharing responsibilities of global governance under this purported model of G2. When it comes to Sino-British relations, on the other hand, it was clear that the Brits had accepted the fact of a handover. They felt that the transition and transfer of the sovereignty to China of Hong Kong was inevitable. So that was the broader geopolitical context. Whereas domestically in Hong Kong, this was an era that was characterized by seeming stability on the surface that mirrored the events that occurred internationally, but with fundamental downstreams or undercurrents that were harbinger of the events to come. And there were three broad trends that we would highlight here. The first was the escalating social economic inequalities under the reluctance or the reticence on the part of the then chief executive to construct more public housing, but also the laissez-faire economic policies had inadvertently or indirectly benefited the most well-endowed and also established real estate property developers and oligarchs in the city. The second was rising uneasiness over Hong Kong's relationship with the mainland, especially when it comes to the influx of mainland Chinese tourists and other factors that the Hong Kong residents were instigated into or stoked into believing were inimical towards Hong Kong culture. And the final undercurrent, which stretched itself way sort of forward into 2008 to 2016 period, was a genuine sense of disillusionment at the stagnating wages, that despite the best efforts of civil society actors and companies, the wages of the youth, especially the lower middle class and the middle class, had remained largely stagnant between 1997 and 2008. Indeed, there was a dip, in fact, during 2003 when Hong Kong was heavily hit by SARS and the ensuing pandemic. So now we're going to move forward to phase 3, where I'm going to try and be as concise as possible. In 2008 to 2016, there are broadly 3 top-level events. 2 were international and 1 was domestic. The first was this heightened sense that the Chinese conception of nationalism and also its global multipolar order might not conform with what the West had anticipated to be the ensuing consequences of the responsible stakeholder approach that Bob Zoellick had preached. And instead, both whether it be under Obama and subsequently, the later years of Bush, there was a realization that China might be developing its own conception of how it negotiated with the global South, how it engaged with Europe, and how it dealt with Asia in means that did not comport, so to speak, with the American demands. And that obviously raised quite a few alarm bells within Washington as they sought to develop strategies of managing and then gradually towards quasi-containing and balancing China's rise in the region. The second international force that's relevant, though, is also the surge in populism across both Europe, the UK, and America, where despite claims of fostering the golden era of UK-China relations, as touted by the likes of Gideon Osborne and David Cameron in London, the grassroots sentiments on the ground in the UK were palpably shifting towards a more Sino-skeptic position throughout the period, especially towards the tail end of this particular phase after the umbrella movement within Hong Kong. And domestically in Hong Kong, we saw the symmetric rise in both localism as a very virulent form of nativist, inward-looking right-wing sentiments amongst the younger generations in the city, as well as recalcitrance of the establishment as increasingly Beijing saw the problems of social unrest and discontent in Hong Kong through lenses of securitization, as opposed to merely the internal management of divisions and divergences amongst stakeholders. And that ties me on to the final phase, which essentially is what has happened in Hong Kong since 2016, probably best hallmarked by the 2019 protests, but also by extension, a variety of other contentious politics episodes that erupted here. And here there are 2 trends, one international and one domestic, that we would like to highlight. The international trend was the obvious fraying and deterioration in Sino-American relations, whether it be in form of the trade war, speculation and allegations and accusations over the origins of COVID, and finally, of course, the national security concerns or the alleged national security concerns that precipitated the series of delistings, retaliatory sanctions, as well as, of course, more condemnatory and bellicose rhetoric from Washington and Beijing alike towards one another. That's the international context, whereas domestically in Hong Kong, we saw through the anti-extradition bill protests in 2019, the eruption of arguably the most violent, most large-scale, and most systemic contentious politics in recent history in Hong Kong, at least since the late 1960s. It's never been seen to such scale and also intensity since then. All of these historical narratives or fragments of historicization would inevitably lead you to ask, so what's the upshot? Why are we talking about Hong Kong history? Why do we care? And this ties me on to the final slide in the concluding statement of today's presentation, which is also the theses that undergird our paper. So onto the final slide we now turn. What are the takeaways from this discussion? We firmly believe that the example of Hong Kong illustrates the importance of adopting a multi-layer and interactive framework in deconstructing how domestic and international forces are deeply intertwined and mutually interactive. And our core thesis is this: the more stable and routine and regular the interactions and dynamics between superpowers, e.g. in this case China and America, are, the less agency there is for domestic or local actors to induce changes both locally speaking and also internationally speaking. On the flip side, right, the more unstable or destabilizes seeming equilibrium is, then the greater the room there is within this political opportunity structure for spontaneous disruptions and critical forking. And one of the most sort of demonstrative examples in recent history in East Asia, in our view, is the 2019 protests in Hong Kong, which substantially accelerated the securitization of the city, as well as the political assimilation of the city into the rest of the country, e.g. China, coupled with, of course, the reciprocal decoupling of the West from Hong Kong, whether it be through the US stripping Hong Kong of its special status, or other gestures and rhetorics that suggest that America no longer sees Hong Kong as different or distinctive from mainland China. And the core pivot here and the core crux here was obvious. It was not, you know, a unilateral decision from Washington, nor was it indeed an unequivocal or unilateral imposition from Beijing that kickstarted all of this. It was instead the attempt to pass on a local level a bill, an otherwise innocuous legislative package that nevertheless triggered long-standing grievances within Hong Kong. And obviously, going back to what Dr. Simons was talking about, there were involvements of extraneous factors and exogenous forces, including political meddling and participation from foreign actors. But had it not been for the domestic grievances and a long-standing inequalities, housing issues, and destitution of the youth, coupled with the feeling of resentment, of antagonism towards an establishment that was perceived to be unresponsive to the people, there would not have been such a seismic C-scale shift in terms of what actually occurred in Hong Kong. And this is why we, Jason and I, firmly believe that understanding local politics and local interactions between sort of subnational or sub-state actors is pivotal in comprehending critical junctures like the 2019 protests, and of course other episodes we can talk about later on, the Gilets jaunes in France, or what's going on in Iran right now, and previously the Euromaidan protests in Ukraine as well in 2014. And with that, we thus conclude our presentation. Thank you very much for bearing with us. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for bringing this much detailed information and insightful information from Hong Kong, especially now it's very late in Hong Kong. Thank you for staying with us. And it's late already in Armenia as well. And we're asking our audience whether they have questions to our distinguished speakers. There is a question, yeah. I have to pass on the microphone.
Thank you. For those of you who are not here physically, my name is Radu Sava from the University of Bucharest. I was very intrigued by what Dr. Arežina said about the case of the Republic of Moldova. And you know, given the circumstances that we've been here for almost 9 hours now, my question is, can I get in touch with you and email you my question? Or if I have more questions.
Very interesting and very important question. A question about delivering of a question to Dr. Sanja Arežina from Serbia.
No, I used to have this kind of questions. So the organizers can give you my contact details, so we can be in touch in the next period if you would like to ask me something more about this issue.
Thank you. That's all I needed. Your agreement. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I think that we can close this panel as well, and we can wish great success and good night to our guests and panel discussions. And also, I would like to thank everyone for being so interested in all the topics and for staying with us. It's a really mainstream academia today. So thank you everyone for staying here and see you tomorrow. Have a good evening. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.